Hi everyone, thank you for coming to our talk. I'm Hannah Haynie from the University of Colorado Boulder, and my colleagues and I today are going to be talking to you a little bit about how we use data from Grambank, a typological database, to look at some issues that come up when we translate information from linguistic descriptions to typological data. In a very big picture sense, the questions that we are interested in are how well described are the languages around the world? And what can we learn about the description of languages around the world from the gaps that we find in typological coding?
Hello, my name is Hedvig Skirgård and I'm a postdoc at the Department for Linguistic and Cultural Evolution at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, and I'm going to tell you about our database Grambank. So Grambank is a bank of grammatical features. We have over 2,000 languages in the database currently from all over the world. And we have 195 grammatical features, most of them being binary. This is an international big collaboration between the Max Planck for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, the Australian National University, and the University of Auckland, and a few other associations. Over the years, we've had a lot of Grambank coders, student assistants that were trained to code these languages. Some of them are shown here. And yes, as I said, we have 195 features on morphosyntax, covering a lot of domains that we have within the project described as core grammatical domains, such as nominal classification, number, core participant marking, tense aspect, mood, valency, negation, and various kinds of predication. So the way it works is a field linguist exists in the world and writes a grammar. We read it, we train and employ grammar coders to read grammars, and we have a team of experts who help them when it's hard to understand what the grammar writer is intending or what the language is doing. We also sometimes correspond with language experts, and then that information goes into our database. Here's an example. So we have Grambank feature 114, is a phonologically bound reflexive marker on the verb. And here's an example of the language Yami, in where there is a prefix, which the grammar writer describes as durative or reflexive reciprocal actions. And the way we have defined reflexive markers means that this is included, and therefore it gets coded as a 1, which means yes. And we note down what the source is and what page. And sometimes we also write a comment if there's something extra to say about it. We encourage to write as many comments as possible.
Like this Yami example, most data points in Grambank are answers to yes or no questions. So this could be answered with a yes, like Yami, or with a no, like Alu Kurumba here. And in some cases, the answer is unclear or unavailable, and in these cases, we answer with a question mark. Coders are encouraged to provide comments anytime coding is not straightforward, or if they have to interpret the data in a grammar, or if the answer is no, because a source does not provide an explicit answer to the question that we're asking. When there's a no in the value field, and not mentioned in the comment field, for example, this means that a coder has judged that in this particular language, or this particular grammatical description, the absence of evidence of this feature constitutes evidence that the feature was absent. Apart from the facts about languages that Grambank encodes in its typological data, the zeros and the ones, Grambank also contains facts about grammatical descriptions, including missing knowledge, which is encoded in question marks, instances where extra reasoning was needed, which can be indicated in the not mentioned comments, uncertainty, added nuance, and other facts that show up in our comment field. This makes Grambank a useful tool not only for typology, but also for exploring descriptive grammars.
I am Tobias from the University of Kiel, and I'm going to tell you about the research questions, data and methods, variation over time, and the conclusions. In this presentation, we look at 2 research questions. First, when we look at the different types of comments and answers, how straightforward is it to translate descriptions into typological data, and how well described are different topics across languages. We also looked at relationships between levels of description in time and macro area. Do researchers working on African and Australian languages pay attention to different topics? Do newer grammars pay more attention to the topics we are considering? Did attention to these topics change over time? So, how can we approach these questions using Grambank? First, we have a lot of data at our disposal. These data include 412,000 data points, including 74,000 question marks. They also include 117,000 comments, which can be divided into 42,000 different comment types. For our analysis, we reduced those 42,000 to 6 types. Those types are no comment, not mentioned, specific comments about the analysis of a feature in a language, a statement that the answer was logically deduced from another fact, for instance, demonstratives don't agree in gender because there is no gender, then a note on other closely related varieties or on the reference, and finally passing, which doesn't really say much for our purposes. To answer the first question, how straightforward the topic is to translate into typological values, we conceptualize straightforwardness as how comfortable a coder feels to code a feature based on the information in a grammar. More formally, we consider a data point straightforward if it is coded as a non-question mark and it has either no comment, a comment on the reference or variety, or a comment that says that it is logically deduced from another fact. We conceptualize the level of description as a measure of whether there is positive evidence of presence or absence of a feature in a grammar. Again, more formally, a data point is considered as described if it is coded as a non-question mark and there is no comment, a specific comment, or a comment on the reference or variety. After we'd coded for each data point, whether it counts as straightforward or described or not, we derive the description rate and the straightforwardness score for each of the 195 features in our dataset. We then group these features into functional domains to get scores for domains rather than for individual feature questions.
I am Jakob Lesage from the Humboldt University in Berlin, and I will tell you about the general results and differences between macro areas. These are density plots of the straightforwardness scores for all features per domain. For example, the first plot shows that most features in Grambank dealing with nominal classification cluster around a score of 0.94. The scores we display here are medians, and we ranked the domains from most straightforward to least straightforward. The most straightforward features to code were those to do with nominal classification. This domain seems to be apparent quite early on in the description of a language. The least straightforward features to code were those on derivation. We can look at a similar graph for the description levels. Negation is the best described domain in our set, and comparison scores the lowest. From this very brief overview of the results, we see that the relationship between straightforwardness and level of description is not simple. It's interesting to put the rankings side by side to see if any interesting patterns emerge. Some domains rank low both on straightforwardness and on description, for instance valency, derivation, and complex predicates, and there may be different reasons for this. For instance, different types of complex predicates have been notoriously difficult to define, and it's still difficult to distinguish categories like serial verb constructions, light verb constructions, and verbal compounds when we look at things from a cross-linguistic perspective. And this has also made such constructions difficult to identify and describe in some individual languages. And then as another example, derivation is a tricky domain because grammarians have to deal with the unclear productivity and multifunctionality of derivational markers, which is often treated only very briefly in grammars and grammar sketches. Some domains rank higher on straightforwardness than on description, and these then are domains that may be of interest to a typologist, but are perhaps less immediately interesting to someone describing a language. They are, so to say, low-hanging fruit of description, relevant to the academic audience of a grammar, but often overlooked and fairly straightforward to describe. Many grammars don't make an explicit statement about the counting system of a language, for instance. It can be difficult to know how numerals over 40 are formed if a grammar illustrates only low numerals. Some domains are less straightforward, but nevertheless well described. Some of these are negation, core participant marking, and TAM. Those are not coincidentally domains that a lot of typological research has gone into. Typological research has produced questionnaires that have also assisted people describing languages. They are good examples of fruitful collaboration between typology and description, rendering both more insightful typologies and more comprehensive descriptions. We now move on to variation we found across macro areas. Does variation in description per domain vary geographically? Well, here we see the 6 macro areas used by Glottolog that we also used, which are Africa, Australia, Eurasia, North America, Papuasia, and South America. And the graph also displays their mean description scores for comparative constructions. These are best described in Eurasia, but less well described in other parts of the world. They are particularly poorly described in Australian languages. If we then look at the bigger picture, we see that there is generally some variation across macro areas. Notably, Eurasia in green scores highest on almost all topics, and as we saw, it is a particular outlier for comparative constructions, but then Australia in yellow tends to score lowest across topics. There is a notable exception for Australia for complex predicates, where Australia scores highest.
Now, let's have a look at the levels of description over time. Here, we illustrate the evolution of the description of just one grammatical domain in our data, namely comparative constructions, and we see that the level of description of comparative construction is quite uneven in different macro areas and also over time. Now, Eurasia generally scores quite high across time, but we also have gaps in descriptions from the first half of the 20th century, since we mainly included the much better grammars from more recent decades. In contrast to Eurasia, in Africa and Papuasia, at the top and at the bottom here, comparative constructions had more priority in the early 20th century than after the 1950s. Overall, the description rate has remained quite low in recent years in most parts of the world, although we also see what seems to be increases in Africa, North America, and Papuasia in the 2010s. Now, how can we interpret this data? Early descriptions may have actively looked for comparative constructions similar to those in Eurasian languages. In later descriptions, researchers might have focused on describing languages in their own terms, so comparison was sometimes ignored altogether. More recently, researchers have started to pay more attention to non-Eurasian type comparative constructions ignored earlier, and this might explain some peaks in the 2010s. Wrapping up, typological databases like Grambank can give insights into trends in linguistic description. Interaction between description and typology leads to better typologies and to more comprehensive descriptions. Some specific observations we've seen in this talk are that the relationship between level of description and straightforwardness is complex. Features that are less described are not necessarily less straightforward. We have also seen that description levels vary across space and time, and that some topics remain underdescribed, even generally well-researched ones such as comparative constructions, predicative possession, and complex predicates. Finally, we have some take-home messages. The first is that what is trivial to a grammar writer is not always trivial to a grammar reader. It is good to spell things out, even if they seem obvious. Second, and possibly most importantly, we should acknowledge gaps and uncertainties in our analysis and data. If we do this as typologists, actually looking at where data is missing. This creates opportunities for description and new discoveries. If we do this as grammar writers, this prevents typologists to make the wrong inferences from absence of evidence in a grammar. Thank you for your attention.